Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very grateful that you're willing to let me speak to you in English. I'm sorry I can't speak to you in Swedish, and I will try to speak slowly and carefully. I know I have a tendency to speak quickly, especially when I get enthusiastic. So if I become too enthusiastic, please let me know, and I'll slow down, okay? And if at any time you have trouble understanding what I'm saying, don't hesitate to let me know. I'll try to find some other way to say it, okay? The official topic of this talk is, can we make a science out of survival research? I want to get to that eventually, but in order to do that, I need first to summarize some of my general views about the topic of survival and also what I think about the current state of research on survival. And I think in light of all of that, it will become clear why I say some of the things I say about whether survival research can be scientific. Okay? It seems to me that most people have one of two misconceptions about survival research. Some think the evidence for survival is worse than it is. And that's because they simply don't realize how good the best cases of survival really are, and how difficult it is to explain away those cases in normal terms. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who overestimate the evidence for survival and think the evidence is better than it is. And I believe that they don't appreciate how difficult it is to rule out some more or less abnormal or almost normal explanations of the best cases, especially those in which it looks like we're trying to show that living people are producing evidence that just simulates or gives the appearance of evidence for survival. This is sometimes called the super-PSI explanation or super-ESP explanation, and I will talk about that as we go along. So some of what interests me the most about the literature on survival and the cases is how they show that human beings are actually a great deal more interesting than we tend to give them credit for. And I mean the living, by the way, okay? So that's the issue I want to focus most on before I get to the actual question about whether we can make survival research scientific. I want to consider how difficult it is to rule out these, let's call them exotic counter-explanations of the evidence for survival. Those explanations that claim that what's really going on are living people doing some extraordinary things that simply looks like evidence for survival. It turns out that this issue is much more complicated than most people appreciate. And some of what's most interesting, I think, about survival research has to do with just those issues. Am I making sense so far? Okay. It can't last. Can everyone see that? Let's be clear, first of all, about how we should evaluate apparently good evidence. And generally speaking, we want to say that a case suggests post-mortem survival when two conditions are met. First, that some living person demonstrates knowledge or abilities closely, if not uniquely, associated with the deceased person. And second, that we have good reason to believe that this knowledge was not obtained or the abilities developed through ordinary means. So, for example, suppose that a medium appears to channel information from my deceased Uncle Harry. And suppose that the medium gives me some information, like the location of a secret will, that no living person besides Harry knew anything about, at least normally, okay? And suppose that although the medium never met my uncle, she takes on various of his personality characteristics and physical characteristics, like his distinctive sense of humor, his perspective on politics and very specific opinions on politics, his distinctive laugh, his distinctive inflection in the way that he speaks. And suppose that the medium also demonstrates my Uncle Harry's ability to speak Russian, even though she never studied or, let's say, ever heard the Russian language. Okay? So the question is, what do we do when we're confronted with a case of that sort? Well, first of all, we need to consider certain alternatives to the survival hypothesis. Okay? Before we can even begin to accept a case as demonstrating survival, we have to rule out a number of other possible explanations. The first set of explanations I call the usual suspects. All right? These would be malobservation, misreporting, fraud, and hidden memories, what's sometimes called cryptomnesia. Now, I actually think it's, in the best cases, it's very easy to rule out the usual suspects. That's why those cases are the best cases. I mean, the usual suspects are actually very easy to rule out. So let's not worry about the usual suspects. Where this gets interesting is with the next set of alternative explanations, and I call these the unusual suspects. And those explanations posit, if not abnormal, at least unusual abilities of the living. For example, like a combination of dissociation with latent creative capacities, or unusual memory, mnemonic gifts, or something like extreme or rare forms of savantism, something like an idiot savant. And it seems to me that here it becomes much more difficult to rule out these counter-explanations to the best cases of survival. For example, think about prodigies and savants and other very gifted, unusually gifted people. Often they can demonstrate some very interesting abilities without having to first undergo the usual period of practice. And this turns out to be relevant to many cases suggesting survival, where mediums or children in reincarnation cases demonstrate unusual abilities that they presumably never prepared for. All right? You may also know that some savants have extremely unusual abilities, sometimes quite dramatic abilities, and not only did they not practice them first before they first demonstrated them, often savants' abilities are radically discontinuous with their ordinary abilities. So, for example,
what is savantism?
I'm sorry?
What is savantism?
Savantism? Well, let me give you some examples. There are some so-called calculating savants. They're just brilliant calculators. They can do amazing sorts of calculations. There are some calculating savants who ordinarily seem somewhat retarded. They might be able to factor any number you give to them, but they cannot add the change in their pocket coins. They cannot do simple arithmetic. Okay? There's a famous musical savant who is a gifted pianist, but until he sits down at the piano to play, he's spastic. He can't coordinate at all. Okay? So we've got those kinds of unusual cases where not only do people exhibit quite remarkable abilities without practice, but those abilities are quite different from what we would expect given their usual handicaps or lack of abilities. Am I making this clear? And you see, this is relevant to some cases of mediumship or apparent reincarnation, where people apparently all of a sudden exhibit some ability that seems to be quite different from their other abilities. We can't just say simply that this must come from a deceased individual, because actually we have cases, prodigies, savants, ordinarily gifted athletes, for example, who demonstrate quite remarkable abilities without practice, and sometimes quite different from their usual repertoire of abilities. And it's not just prodigies and savants, by the way. I mean, ordinarily gifted people do this all the time. You know, somebody who is say, a natural athlete might play a terrific game of tennis the first time he picks up a tennis racket, or at least a better game of tennis than some people who are not athletically gifted and who've taken lessons for years. And we need to keep, I believe, these kinds of cases in mind when we look at some of the evidence for survival. Now, for some reasons I will get to a little later, it seems to me that the literature on survival has not done a very good job dealing with the unusual suspects. Okay? But let's suppose we can deal with the unusual suspects. What then? Can we just assume that a case demonstrates survival? It's not that simple. The most difficult counter-explanation to eliminate is what's often called the super-PSI explanation. And the super-PSI explanation posits psychic abilities among the living that simulate or give the appearance of evidence for survival. So we might suppose that the medium who seems to be channeling my Uncle Harry is actually using ESP to, say, find out about Uncle Harry's hidden will, or Uncle Harry's extramarital affair. So the medium could be using clairvoyance to learn about the location of the will. She could be using telepathy to read the minds of various people who knew intimate things about Uncle Harry, and so forth. Okay? That's very roughly the idea of the super-PSI explanation. Now, to many people, this just seems completely implausible, but I want to soften you up a little bit on this. I think we need to actually be a little kinder to the super-PSI hypothesis, and I'll give you some reasons in a moment. Let me first say that there are two versions of the super-PSI hypothesis, and most people don't like either one of them. But let me at least tell you what they are. The first I call the multiple process hypothesis. The idea there is that, let's say, the medium is using a little bit of this psychic ability, a little bit of that psychic ability, you know, a little here, a little there, put it all together, and you have what looks like a case for survival. So we suppose that the medium is using some clairvoyance to find out about Uncle Harry's will, a little bit of telepathy to find out about his extramarital affair, and to find out how Uncle Harry behaved, how he inflected his sentences, and so on. And then we throw in some good abilities to mimic and give dramatic impersonations, and put it all together, put all these abilities together, and you come up with a trance impersonation of Uncle Harry. Now, some people don't like that. It looks to them like that's just attributing way too much to the medium. All right? Bear with me, we'll come back to that point. The magic wand hypothesis usually annoys people even more than the multiple process version. The magic wand version of the super-PSI hypothesis says that there's no real structure to what the medium is doing. It's not a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's almost just like waving a magic wand, and then you come up with a trance impersonation of Uncle Harry. You just get what you want. That there is no specific, definable, underlying set of processes. The medium or the sitters simply want to get an apparent communication from Uncle Harry, and then everything is there at the medium's disposal. The medium has no idea how she does it. There's not a specific set of tasks that's going on. Now, the usual reaction when I say that is that this is a crazy idea. Before you jump to that conclusion, though, let me remind you that we actually have evidence for something like this in, say, biofeedback research. You might know that, say, in some biofeedback experiments, subjects have learned to fire a single muscle cell in the arm and none of the surrounding cells, just by biofeedback. Okay? Now that's a very interesting result. And it's clear that the subjects have no idea how they're doing that. They're not monitoring their internal physical processes. They're looking at a biofeedback device. They're looking at some display that they use to train themselves to fire just a single muscle cell. Okay? And we also know from biofeedback research that subjects do best at this when they don't actively try and when there's a kind of release of effort. Okay? When they actually stop trying and just wish or will for the result to happen. So we know from biofeedback research that subjects have learned to do some pretty extraordinary things without there being some clear set of underlying procedures that they go through. They basically want it to happen, and then it happens. So it's not as if we have no precedent whatsoever for the kind of idea that underlies the magic wand hypothesis. The magic wand hypothesis just says something like this happens even in the case of psi. That you wish for a certain result, and then you get it. There is no clear answer to how that happens, just as there is no clear answer in the case of biofeedback research. Okay? Now, one of the reasons I wrote the book Immortal Remains was to get some things off my chest. And I have a number of long-standing complaints about the literature on survival. There are a number of things about it that I find very unsatisfactory. And it's not because I just like to complain. What I want to see happen is to make sure that the literature gets better. And it's not going to get better unless people appreciate what's wrong with it now. So let me tell you some of the problems with the survival literature. First of all, many people are confused because of the unfortunate term super-PSI. I'm sorry that that term ever came into being, but we have it and we're stuck with it. First of all, there's a problem with the term super. First of all, it's unclear. Okay? What's super for one person may not be super for somebody else, right? And also, it seems inappropriately evaluative. And on top of that, some people seem to think that anything called super-PSI just because it's called super, has to be implausible right from the beginning. And to me, that suggests they take the term super in super-PSI to be like the term super in superhero, rather than in super glue. I don't know if in Swedish in the US we have something called super glue. It's just really good glue, okay? And nobody bothers about the term super glue. We understand what that means. It's damn good glue, right? Okay? So we don't think that it's impossible glue because we call it super. We understand that we're meaning really good glue. And on the other hand, superhero does sound like it's supposed to be implausible right from the beginning. So I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about super-PSI that the word super is more like its use in super glue than in superhero. And there's another problem with this too. And that is that many people assume that if super-PSI occurs, that we would know it when we saw it. There's an expression in English that certain very obvious things stick out like a sore thumb. Okay, so if you have a sore thumb, it sticks out. You don't want to put it anywhere. It's just sticking out, right? So I call this the sore thumb assumption. The idea that many people have is that if super-PSI really occurred, if this remarkable degree of psychic functioning really occurred, we'd be spotting it all the time. We'd know that it occurred. And I think we have to be careful about that as well. It's not clear to me that even remarkably refined or remarkably large-scale psi would have to be obvious. Even if super-PSI is occurring, even if really good psychic functioning is occurring, it could be integrated smoothly into everyday events. So for example, if I can psychically cause a car to crash, there doesn't have to be any observable difference between a car crash caused by psychokinesis and one caused by brake failure. Okay? The only difference might be in their underlying and unobservable causal histories. In other words, they may be observationally indistinguishable. Right? So for all we know, really large-scale or refined PK, psychokinesis, could be occurring more or less all the time and inconspicuously. Super-PSI doesn't have to just do with things that would stick out like a sore thumb, like table levitations. A table levitation would stick out like a sore thumb, but maybe that's not what PK is usually doing in life. It may be integrating itself smoothly into daily affairs. And the same would be true about ESP. It's not clear that even if you're having really refined ESP experiences, really specific, detailed ESP, it's not clear that you have to know it when it's happening. I mean, it's not as if when we have an ESP experience, right before that happens, we have something like an internal flourish of trumpets, or an announcer that says, your next experience will be ESP. Okay? It doesn't have to be that way. ESP experiences could also just be integrating themselves smoothly into your stream of thoughts. I mean, all the time we have incongruous thoughts. They just pop in out of our heads. We don't know why. Maybe some of those, no doubt, we generate ourselves. But maybe some of those have to do with the way others' thoughts are impacting ours. So we may be getting lots of information that we have no clue what to do with. So we might be interacting all the time with the minds of strangers. It's not clear that we would know. So even if we're interacting in various refined ways all the time with strangers, it's not clear that we would know. So it just seems false that even if refined psychic functioning is occurring of the kind that we would need to explain away survival cases, it's not clear that we would know it if we saw it. Am I intelligible so far?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, let me say something about how difficult it is to rule out super-PSI explanations. Here I have to be a little philosophical. It's my job, okay? First of all, in principle, just as a matter of principle, we have no basis for ruling out super-PSI explanations once we have allowed any psychic functioning to occur at all, okay? Consider. Even if psychic functioning occurs, and I assume that it does, we know almost nothing about, let's call it the natural history of psi. we know almost nothing about what psychic functioning is doing in daily life, for some of the reasons that I just mentioned. We don't know how it's integrating itself into daily affairs, or to what extent it's integrating itself into daily affairs. We don't know what general role it's playing in life, if it plays any general role in life. We don't know how it guides adaptation or enables us to get through life, or whether it's more of a problem than a benefit. These are basic sorts of things that we really still do not know. But in that case, considering the magnitude of our ignorance about psi, and it's considerable, then we, at this stage in our ignorance, we have to entertain or consider the possibility of extensive psi once we allow for the possibility of modest or moderate psi. We have no grounds for ruling it out. In fact, I would go further. I would say it's methodologically indefensible to open the door to the paranormal, even if we're just doing it as a thought experiment, even if you're a skeptic and you're just giving a thought experiment. I'd say you cannot open the door to the paranormal and then simply decide to open it just a little. Okay? So, considering how little we know about psi, we can't just say, all right, let's suppose that psi exists, but only this much. I mean, at this stage, if we're going to say, let's suppose that psi exists, then until we have some reason for limiting what psi can do, I think we have to be open to the possibility that if it can happen all the way and to any degree whatsoever. And considering our level of ignorance, we have no basis right now for closing the door and just leaving it open a little. Now, I realize that's an abstract reason, but I think it's correct, and I think it's also a powerful reason for being open to the possibility of really extensive and refined psychic functioning. There's another problem, too. You know, in some good mediumistic cases, it looks like the medium had to have gotten information psychically, if the medium is doing this, from a number of obscure sources. So, going back to the case of my Uncle Harry, we might suppose that the medium used some clairvoyance to locate the secret will, and then read the minds of quite a number of other different people to find out about details of Harry's life and to find out details about his behavior so that she could give a good trance impersonation of Uncle Harry and reveal lots of intimate and quite specific and obscure details about Uncle Harry. So it looks like the medium had to use psychic functioning to raid or to get information from a number of very obscure sources. And to many people, it looks like that's just too much obscure information to be accessible by psi. Okay? Now, what I want to say about that is that we have to be careful about how we understand the term obscure information when we talk about psi. Our ordinary concept of obscure information pertains only to normal sources of information acquisition. I mean, ordinarily, we consider information to be obscure when it's physically isolated from us, okay? When it's outside our perceptual field, or when it's otherwise difficult to get to physically. You know, if it's behind layers of security, or if it's remote geographically, or hidden electronically, something like that. But by contrast to that, we don't understand how any information is accessible to ESP. And it doesn't matter whether the information is 1,000 miles away or whether it's in a sealed envelope in front of us. I mean, the point is that information, let's say a target picture in a sealed envelope, that's normally obscure. We have no way of perceiving it if it's in an opaque sealed envelope. So the target photograph or picture in the sealed envelope is normally obscure, but it needn't be psychically obscure. If you think about Joe McMoneagle and other great remote viewers, Joe was terrific and is terrific at getting information, specific information that is normally obscure, but clearly isn't psychically obscure. So we're in no position to say what is difficult for someone to access psychically. Just because bits of information are normally obscure doesn't mean that they're difficult to get to psychically. And for all we know, it's no more difficult for a good psychic subject to get information from a number of normally obscure sources. It may be irrelevant to psi. We just don't know. So we can't assume that there is some nice parallel between information being normally obscure and it's being psychically obscure. It doesn't work that way at all. So we're in no position to say what's too obscure for a medium to get. I hope I've made that clear. Now, that's not all. Once we allow our explanations of survival cases to include psychic functioning among the living, then it seems that any evidence suggesting survival of death can be explained in terms, any evidence can be explained in terms of psychic functioning among the living. For example, so long as we can verify the information that a medium has given us, then the information could have been accessed by ESP. So the medium tells us about Uncle Harry's will. How do we know it's true? We find the will. The will was where she said it was. That means we could verify it. Well, if we could verify it normally, then the medium could get to it clairvoyantly. So the medium tells us about Uncle Harry's extramarital affair. How do we verify that? We talk to the woman, okay? Or someone who knew about the affair. So if we can verify it, if the information was available normally to us, it could be available paranormally to the medium. Right? So just as a matter of principle, if information in a good survival case can be verified, then it's also accessible to ESP. And, I mean, it doesn't always have to be the medium's ESP. I mean, if a sitter at a seance knows these facts, we can't rule out telepathic influence by the sitter on the medium. We're in no position to rule that out either. It gets very messy. Now, most important, can you all see this? Ironically, I mean, people who are in favor of the survival hypothesis cannot object to super-psi explanations because it turns out that the survival hypothesis requires super-psi. It requires comparably impressive feats of ESP. Let me give you an example. Instead of saying that the medium interacts telepathically with someone at a seance or somebody remotely, survivalists have to say that there's a direct mind-to-mind connection between the medium and the deceased. That's telepathy. It's no different when you've got the medium interacting telepathically with some living person or the medium interacting telepathically with the deceased. It's telepathy in both cases. The only difference between them is that in the survivalist scenario, one of the people in the interaction is deceased. But it's still mind-to-mind interaction. Similarly, instead of saying that the medium clairvoyantly is looking at physical states of affairs, say to find Uncle Harry's will, Survivalists have to say that the communicator is using clairvoyance to know what's going on in the physical world. If the communicator says to the sitter at a seance, "You're wearing a very nice dress today," that's a mental awareness of a physical state of affairs without intermediate operation of sense organs. That's clairvoyance. So survivalists can't object to super-ESP because they actually require super-ESP to explain what the communicators are doing. Am I still clear? Dumb luck. Now, I told you I had some other complaints about the evidence or the literature on survival. Let me talk about these for a little bit. One thing that I find surprising and actually pretty annoying is the level of ignorance displayed by writers on survival when it comes to the unusual suspects. For example, a number of writers on reincarnation make some, I think, very reckless claims about the limits of human abilities. When they say, for example, that, say, a child in a reincarnation case couldn't have manifested certain abilities without practice. This brings us back to the topic of prodigies and savants and ordinarily gifted people. I mean, we need to consider, well, there are a number of issues here that are not being dealt with. First of all, and these are all things that I felt I needed to address in Immortal Remains because nobody else seems to be talking about them. One general question is, what exactly are human abilities? Do we understand what a human ability is? Do we understand what the limits of human abilities are? Do we understand how similar abilities are to one another? That's an issue that comes up, for example, when, say, Ian Stevenson compares the difficulty of learning to speak a language to learning to play bridge or to ride a bicycle. Fact is, we don't know whether certain kinds of abilities are relevantly similar to certain others. They don't all seem to be the same. It's significant, for example, that prodigies seem to come in certain specific areas. There are lots of mathematical prodigies, musical prodigies, artistic prodigies. You don't see literary prodigies. Many gifted writers, but not literary prodigies. I don't believe that there's anyone in literature comparable to, say, in music, Mendelssohn or Mozart or Saint-Saëns, or in math to Gauss, let's say. People who, at a very young age, demonstrated quite astounding abilities, presumably out of thin air. I mean, Mozart had the ability to improvise a sonata, transpose it, and then play it in another key. Okay? He didn't have to practice that first. And the abilities, the astounding abilities that appear de novo in the cases of prodigies are much more impressive than the abilities we see in some of the cases suggesting survival. Usually these are topics that come up in connection with xenoglossy, speaking unlearned languages. So when there are reincarnation or mediumistic cases in which the medium or the child seems to be able to say a few sentences responsively in a language that they never formally studied, we need to consider how impressive that really is. Is it really impressive compared to the abilities of savants and prodigies when they first appeared? I actually think not. And in order to understand that, we need to take a closer look at what it means to speak a second language, which again is something that writers on survival have not looked at very carefully. It turns out that second language acquisition is a very complex topic. And language mastery is a very complex topic. Language mastery is not one simple thing. There are different ways of mastering a language, all of which count as examples of language mastery. I can't go into all the gory details here. It's, again, one of the topics I wanted to address in Immortal Remains. But it's the kind of thing that needs to be looked at very carefully before we know what to say about cases where there seems to be somebody speaking an unlearned language. And there are many other things that are very careless about the literature. For example, Ian Stevenson talks about how implausible it is for children to acquire, or mediums to acquire these new abilities. You know, it's very easy to get misled by language. And I think it was a mistake to say right from the start that these people acquired the abilities. We have no idea at what point they might have acquired the abilities. What we know is that they manifested or displayed the abilities at a certain time. And again, what we know about prodigies and savants and just ordinarily gifted people is that they can manifest abilities without certain kinds of what for most of us would be prerequisites, you know, practice and formal education or something like that. So when it's just manifesting or displaying the ability that's at issue, perhaps these cases don't seem quite so remarkable. Again, that's something that I believe needs to be looked at much more closely. I'm also really disturbed at the level of psychological superficiality of many of the writers on survival. And this I find particularly annoying when the people who are writing about survival are themselves psychologists or psychiatrists, people who should know more about human beings. You shouldn't need a philosopher to point these things out, you know, because ordinarily philosophers don't know anything about human beings. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote a book on multiple personality before writing a book on survival was because it's completely clear how many cases suggesting survival look a lot like cases of dissociation or cases of multiple personality. So one of the questions that needs to be addressed, obviously, is to what extent might mediums be exhibiting what we see in cases of multiple personality? Are apparent communicators something like temporary secondary personalities of the medium who simply claim to be surviving spirits? Now, the fact is, you can't do a decent job of answering that question unless you know a lot about dissociation and multiple personality. Since most of the opinions I found in the literature on survival showed an almost total lack of familiarity with the clinical literature on dissociation and multiple personality, I felt I needed to master it myself. Okay? But this shouldn't be my job. I mean, I would expect the people who are in psychology and in psychiatry who are writing on these cases to know more about this stuff. That's one problem. Another problem is that it seems to me that many of the writers on survival treat their subjects like psychological stick figures. You know, they have about as much depth as this. That's not a human being, you know. They treat their subjects as something like nothing but emitters of psychic functioning or vehicles for psychic functioning, not real flesh and blood creatures with issues, you know, lots of problems in their life with needs and agendas and so on. So the real question we need to ask about subjects in survival cases is, whose needs would be satisfied by the appearance of evidence for survival? Whose needs would be satisfied by the appearance of evidence for survival? And to answer that, we need to take a close look at the lives of the subjects in the cases to see what real deep difference it makes to them if it looks like there's some evidence for survival. Who stands something to gain from this? But that question is almost never dealt with competently. Almost never. And a number of detailed after-the-fact inquiries, I think, show why it's important. Two of them I go into in Immortal Remains. One is a case that Jewel Eisenbud wrote about years ago, having to do with the American medium, Mrs. Chenoweth, and some communications she seemed to be displaying from the Italian Count Cagliostro. Okay? It's a very interesting case, and there are good reasons for thinking it couldn't possibly have been Cagliostro, and that once you understand the real character of the people who are at the seance, it looks like the Cagliostro trance persona was really answering to the sexual inhibitions of all the people who are at the seance. This makes sense not just because Eisenbud was a Freudian. I mean, it actually makes a lot of sense, okay? I mean, I know sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but this time it really made sense. Another example is the famous case of Sharada, an Indian case of a woman a Marathi woman who apparently fluently spoke a somewhat archaic, different dialect, different Indian dialect, okay, Bengali dialect. Many people, including Ian Stevenson, I think completely overestimated this case, completely missed what I see as the flagrant psychopathology of the subject in this case. And when you look carefully at the case, what you see is good reason for explaining it all in terms of dissociation or some other kind of psychopathology, and maybe a little psi thrown in. But in many ways I respect Stevenson's work, but the degree of psychological superficiality of his analysis I found absolutely shocking. And what I believe we learn from the cases of Sharada and the Cagliostro case is why it really matters. Why it really matters that we take a close look at the inner lives of the people in survival cases to see what in the world is going on. We can't just assume that they have nothing going on inside their heads other than what's most evident on the surface. We need to look a little deeper. Okay? Those are my general complaints about the literature on survival. And I feel much better for having told you about them. Okay. Now let me address the topic that I'm supposed to be talking about, and that is whether we can make survival research scientific. First of all, I think we need to ask, what makes a field scientific? I mean, this is not a simple question either. And I think the first thing we need to understand is there is no such one thing as the scientific method. I mean, Aristotle recognized this over 2,000 years ago. But many people since seem to have missed the point. Aristotle recognized that there are different and perfectly legitimate forms of explanation and understanding, and that different areas of empirical inquiry require different methodologies. You don't investigate every phenomenon the same way. Different kinds of phenomena require different approaches, just like different people do. I mean, this is not a hard point. How people miss it, again, is one of these things that just totally blows me away. I mean, look, in some sciences, for example, experimentation plays a very critical, central role, right? But not in every science. In some other sciences, even in some other physical sciences, experimentation is relatively unimportant. Like geology is one, astronomy is another, meteorology, climatology. These are all perfectly legitimate areas of scientific inquiry, but they are areas in which experimentation plays little, if any, central role. So in that case, the issue of experimental repeatability is clearly not an issue either. If experimentation is relatively unimportant, then repeatability is relatively unimportant. I mean, sometimes you can have a science that deals with unpredictable events, or sometimes once-in-a-lifetime occurrences or extremely rare occurrences. You just have to be alert and collect data and hope another one comes along. Okay? You don't want to find yourself in the completely untenable position of saying you cannot have a science that deals with spectacular and extremely rare phenomena. It just imposes its own constraints on you. The domain tells us what we need to do. Now, I'm not sure I can tell you what, if any, one thing makes a field scientific. But I would say that it has to do with how well or how it manages to systematize, to make systematic, or to organize the domain of phenomena that it deals with. And how well a field organizes or systematizes the phenomena depends on the method that the field adopts. And which method is appropriate depends on a couple of things. I think the two main things are these. First, the nature of the domain of phenomena. I mean, are the phenomena things that can be studied in a lab, or do they have to be studied in the field? For example, I think psychology took a wrong turn years ago by thinking we could bring human beings into the lab and study them as if they were chemicals in solution. I mean, most of the interesting things we want to know about human beings can only be studied in real-life contexts. I mean, most of what really matters about human beings matters about character. And character you cannot study in the straitjacketed conditions of a laboratory experiment. You have to study people in vivo. You have to see them in real-life situations to find out what they do and what their regularities are. So if you want to find out about the human ability to be diplomatic, or about things like sexuality or courage or other aspects of character, these are things you have to study in life. You cannot really learn about this in all its richness in a lab. Now, you might be able to bring certain abilities into a lab situation to study them after we have some idea what they're doing in life. See, we can do that with memory, for instance. There are some aspects of memory that we can study in laboratory situations. But that's because we already have some idea what memory does in real life. We know something about memory's natural history. But we can't do that about psi. We don't know psi's natural history. It's premature to bring it into the lab. If we don't know what it's doing in life, we have no idea whether we should have brought it into the lab in the first place. Whether it's the kind of thing that can even be studied in the artificial conditions of a formal experiment. I mean, this is true of athletic abilities too. If you want to evaluate a tennis player's ability to return serves, you have to study how the player plays in a real game. Practice isn't enough. Some people play better than they practice, or play worse than they practice. Okay? If you want to assess a tennis player's ability to return serves, you have to see how the player does when opponents are trying their hardest to win. Only then will you be able to evaluate it. So we don't know at this stage whether psychic abilities are more like athletic abilities in this respect than other sorts of abilities. So we don't even know to what extent it's appropriate to look at them in a lab. Now, that doesn't mean we can't study these other abilities outside the lab scientifically. It just means we have to adopt a different method. I hope I'm making this clear. Another thing that the appropriate method depends on is the stage of a field's development. So it would be absurd to claim, for example, that Darwin's field observations, or any naturalist's field observations, were not scientific. I mean, those observations were perfectly appropriate to the stage of biology in which Darwin was operating. I mean, it was important to make certain kinds of observations, to observe regularities, to acquire data. It's essential data gathering for taxonomy, for organizing your material. Until you do that, you can't do some things that require it as a prerequisite. Now, parapsychology, it seems to me, is, I don't know if it's at a comparably early stage, but it's certainly at a relatively early stage in its development. I mean, if we don't know the natural history of psi, it's at a very early stage in its development. What I think we need are more people like Darwinian naturalists. We don't need laboratory scientists right now. It seems to me that the real pioneers, the scientific pioneers of psi research, are going to be more like naturalists. They need to be people who have an eye for the phenomena or a nose for the phenomena. You know, choose your orifice, I don't know. But they have to be people who have some ability to observe keenly the right sorts of things. That's an essential component at an early stage in the development of any science. So, I would say, that parapsychology, first of all, is a field in which experiments are relatively unimportant, as I believe is the case in psychology. Unless all you want to do in parapsychology is to prove that anomalies exist. I mean, you probably know the problem. You may not know that it's called the source of psi problem. This is the problem that psychic functioning, assuming it exists, would be the sort of thing that, or for which ordinary experimental controls are completely useless. Okay? You can't, for example, have a controlled experiment for PK, for psychokinesis. There's no way to make sure that only the official subject is going to use PK. Okay? It's not as if you can put PK barriers around everybody else, right? There's no way to be sure that only the official subject is going to use PK, and then only at the time when it's supposed to begin, you know, neither before nor later. There's no way to have literally a double-blind experiment in ESP. I mean, an ESP experiment can only be blind for normal forms of information acquisition. Okay? You can't put ESP barriers around other people. Right? So as far as we know, everybody even remotely connected with the psi experiment could be contributing to the final result. The most we can do in a laboratory experiment is to write down whatever anomalies occur. We can't be sure who's doing what to whom or to when it's happening. There is no way in principle to know. And it blows me away that otherwise smart people in parapsychology do not take this problem more seriously. I mean, they import their experimental procedures from conventional areas of science and they think it's going to work here. The most you can do is just note that anomalies occur. If you want to find out anything about psychic functioning, if you want to do process-oriented research, you can't do it that way. You've got to get out in the field. You have to try to figure out what's going on. I think it's going to be very difficult to do. It doesn't mean it isn't scientific. It poses real interesting methodological problems. So if we want to know something about psi phenomena, then for the reasons I said before, it's premature to bring it into the lab until we know its natural history, until we know its real life, until we know its scope, how broad it can be and its limits. And so since we don't know that, I think we must still consider parapsychology to be at an early developmental stage, where what we need are more naturalists and fewer experimentalists. Now, there's another reason why I think survival research is legitimately scientific. This has to do with the unusual suspects. Because many survival cases promise to expand our understanding of the unusual suspects. Case investigations about survival cases are going to be relevant in the following way. They can help us answer the question about whether there are certain limits to the unusual suspects that we didn't know about, or maybe that there are certain ways in which the unusual suspects are operating in fields that we didn't understand before. So even if we're not learning about actual survival of bodily death, we can learn a lot about human beings from studying these cases. I mean, for example, one of the most interesting cases in the survival literature, I devoted an entire chapter to it because I think it's so important, is the case of Patience Worth. Do any of you know this case? This was the case of a woman in St. Louis, roughly between 1913 and 1937, who initially with a Ouija board started producing trance communications from what she claimed was a 17th century English woman named Patience Worth. What makes the case so interesting is that Patience, the communicator, wrote 6 novels, several plays, thousands and thousands of poems, altogether 29 volumes of material, in a mostly archaic dialect of English, never spoken, with a very high density of 12th and 13th century Anglo-Saxon root words. It was a language never spoken. The woman who produced all of this was a woman with only a very modest 8th grade education, some musical ability, no exposure to literature or to some of the obscure topics that she wrote about. And she had, as far as we can determine, an unprecedented literary gift. She was able to improvise poems on the spot on any topic presented to her, often exquisitely beautiful poems. She could compose these long novels. One was over 600 pages, without ever making a correction. They would just pour out of her. She could stop in mid-sentence on one day, then go on and do something else, and come back to it days later, exactly where she left off, and then continue on. And she did other very remarkable things. On one occasion, she was asked to compose a poem, each line of which began with a different letter of the alphabet, going from A through Z, leaving out X. They gave her a break. And there was a pause of maybe 8 seconds, and the poem came out as quickly as the stenographer could write it down. So now, here's the crucial thing. There's no evidence that there ever was a person named Patience Worth. Evidentially, the case is extremely weak. When you look at the case carefully, it looks like what we have is that the character Patience Worth was a kind of cover for this woman, Pearl Curran. It allowed her to express some political and other opinions and social views that would have been very difficult for a woman in her position to get away with normally. She had some very cynical things to say about education, about religion, about the role of women. Would have been very unpopular for a middle-income Missouri housewife to express these opinions in the early 20th century. So there's every reason to think that what we have here are some extraordinary latent abilities unleashed in, I think, the dissociative state that Pearl was in when she used the Ouija board or then later engaged in automatic writing. And so what I think the case of Patience Worth tells us about, or helps us to understand, are some issues about the latency of creative capacities. we know this from other things about hypnosis and multiple personality. One of the interesting things about multiple personality is that multiples sometimes display abilities that they presumably would never have developed if they hadn't become multiple. Could be artistic abilities, could be linguistic abilities. They tend to be extraordinary people whose abilities are often linked to the specific roles of the alter identities or personalities. And so I think one of the larger issues here is, to what extent might all of us have or be reservoirs of latent creative capacities, which could be unleashed or liberated in the right kind of altered or dissociative state. Cases like the Patience Worth case make this problem extremely vivid, I think. And so even if we don't get conclusive evidence that there's life after death, I think survival cases are important scientifically because they might, if all they do is to teach us about further aspects of ourselves that haven't been fully appreciated, we've learned quite a lot. And I think some of the most interesting cases, which are not evidentially very strong, still tell us quite a lot about ourselves that we might not learn from anything but survival cases. So in that respect also, I think the study of survival cases is scientifically extremely important. Okay? I think it's probably a good time to take a break, and thank you for putting up with my English. And I don't know if you take questions later or